Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to God's Ministry. I'm your host, the Minister, Shabbat Shalom. And this will be the continuation of the firmament, and we had just got done discussing the third heaven. Now we're going to be going into the second heaven. So, the third heaven we found is in 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verse 2. And now we're moving on to the next one, the bottom side of the upper part of the firmament, which is in the firmament, Genesis chapter 1, verses 14 through 19. So the part of this is going to be the cherubim are here holding up the firmament, according to Ezekiel chapter 1, verse 22 and 23. So, what is below this glass on the upper part of the firmament? Well, now that we're done reading about the bottom side of the upper part of the firmament, which goes into the firmament itself, the cherubims are the ones who are holding the bottom part, or the bottom part of the upper firmament. So they're upholding that part there. So next we have the cherubim. Next we have also outer space. The darkness that cloaks our vision from physically seeing through the upper part of the firmament. And the proof of this is in Isaiah chapter 50, verse 3, Psalms chapter 18, verse 11, Psalms chapter 92, verse 7, and Job chapter 22, verse 13 and 14. That's outer space. And you can clearly see that part at night, but you cannot see through it or past it at night. That is the furthest we can see by our own physical eyes. Now that we're done with the outer space, let's go to middle space. So, in middle space, we can see plainly at nighttime, especially when it's not cloudy, the stars, Genesis chapter 1, verse 16, and Job chapter 22, verse 12. And it all moves as one. They don't move in any other obverse directions. They all move singularly as one. And there's also constellations, Isaiah chapter 13, verse 10. There's also wandering stars. In other words, who people call in science, they call these things comets and meteors. In Scripture, they're actually called wandering stars. You can find this in Jude 13. There's also such thing as planets, and you can find these planets in 2 Kings. And unfortunately, I didn't write down the scripture for where it is in 2 Kings, but I will have that listed in the pinned comment section below. But just know that there are such things as planets, and it is in Scripture in the book of 2 Kings. And along with that, there's also worlds. So you can find the worlds in Hebrews chapter 1, verse 2, and also chapter 11, verse 3. So that's in middle space. So if there's an outer space and a middle space, then surely there must also be an inner space. So the inner space is going to be what's closest to the earth. Since outer space is the furthest away, inner space is the closest to the earth. So what is closest to the earth? Closest to the earth is the moon. Genesis chapter 1, verse 15. Ecclesiastes chapter 12, verse 2. And the moon moves around the earth. Job chapter 10, verse 13. The moon has its own circuit around the earth. And also the sun. Genesis chapter 1, verses 14 through 19. And Ecclesiastes chapter 12, verse 2. And also Psalms chapter 74, verse 16. The sun also moves around the earth clockwise. It's actually the moon and sun around the earth, also on top of the earth. As mentioned before, it is like this. This is just a exaggerated representation of the earth. The earth doesn't look like this. It's circular. The sun and moon go like this, as a video I had before this, or a couple videos, but they all go around the earth like this. So, on top of the earth, going around it. According to Psalms 19:6. And there's also the light of 7 days. It's a separate light, a different light than the sun, and a different light than the sun than what the sun puts forth unto the moon. This light, which is a separate thing, can be found in Genesis chapter 1, verse 3 through 5, and also 14 through 19. In Ecclesiastes chapter 2, Ecclesiastes chapter 12, verse 2. Psalms chapter 74, verse 16, and Isaiah chapter 30, verse 26. A shadow of Isaiah chapter 60, verses 19 and 20. The northern lights. There's also such thing as southern lights. However, this is alluded to, possibly, in Ezekiel chapter 1, verse 4. The northern lights and southern lights are the closest of all things to this earth. That actually touches the top side of the bottom part of the firmament, which we can only see at night. All these for signs, seasons, days, and years. Genesis chapter 1, verse 14, Deuteronomy chapter 4, verse 19, Psalms chapter 8, verse 3, and these are bodies celestial. 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 40. And also the top side of the bottom part of the firmament, which is still in the firmament. Genesis chapter 1, verses 14 through 19. So that's what's inside the firmament. So from that right there, we got the top side. We got the top side of the bottom part of the firmament, which is still in the firmament, and then on the opposite side of that, we have the bottom side of the bottom part of the firmament. So on that part there right there, we have the whole firmament from the bottom side of the bottom part to the top side of the top part is the second heaven. Genesis chapter 1, verses 6 to 10. That is the second heaven. So, what's after the bottom part of the what is after the bottom side of the bottom part of the firmament? Well, obviously, the bottom side of the bottom part of the firmament is a glass sky. Job chapter 37, verse 18. And which is upon the circle of the earth. Isaiah chapter 40, verse 22. The color of the firmament is sapphire blue in the daytime. Exodus chapter 24, verse 10. At night, we see through a glass, darkly, a metaphysical pun by Paul. Because also in the spiritual realm, we see darkly through things, but we will see eventually a light. In other words, things will be revealed to us. So that's the thing that he's saying as a pun in the spiritual realm, but in the physical realm, at nighttime we see literally through a glass. 1 Corinthians chapter 13, verse 12. And there is actually something that can touch the bottom side of the bottom part of the firmament, which is called elf lightning. Elf lightning physically touches the surface of the bottom side of the bottom part of the firmament. So what is under the dome of glass? 4 winds of heaven. In other words, the 4 winds of heaven is what people in science has come to know as the 4 jet streams. The 4 jet streams in Scripture is called the 4 winds of heaven. Matthew chapter 24, verse 31, Jeremiah chapter 49, verse 36, Daniel chapter 7, verse 2, and chapter 4, verse 11, and Zechariah chapter 2, verse 6. And then the 4 angels manipulating the winds. Revelation chapter 7, verse 1. These 4 winds of heaven are what we feel. Again, these are the 4 jet streams. And then there are the clouds of heaven. Matthew chapter 26, verse 64, and Mark chapter 16, verse 42. And the birds do fly here. Genesis chapter 1, verse 20, and Ezekiel chapter 31, verse 6. And that's just 2, I think I found like 10 different scriptures actually deal with that. And birds fly in 2 different elevations. The highest elevation they fly in is the heaven. So, and planes this day and age also do fly here too. because of their imaginations. Genesis chapter 8, verse 21. But even their imaginations have limitations. Genesis chapter 11, verse 6. Except cracking, breaking through, and going past the bottom side of the bottom part of the firmament. Nahum chapter 1, verse 9. And also John chapter 3, verse 13. And Isaiah chapter 46, verse 10. Mankind will never be able to go there. Nice try. But you're looking for a high five. It ain't gonna happen in this lifetime. Or in any lifetime. So there is a sea of glass. So we're going past that part now. So, God balances the clouds. Job chapter 37, 16. If you wonder how the clouds are out there, God, the one, balances them all. So he balances the clouds. God makes light showers of rain and heavy showers of rain. Zechariah chapter 10, verse 1, and Ecclesiastes chapter 11, verse 3. Rain comes from heaven. Deuteronomy chapter 11, verse 11, and Acts chapter 14, verse 17. Snow comes from the clouds in heaven. Isaiah chapter 55, verse 10. Hail and coals of fire come from heaven. Psalms chapter 18, verse 12, Psalms chapter 18, verse 12. Where it precipitates from the clouds is the windows of heaven. Genesis chapter 7, verse 11. Genesis chapter 8, verse 2. Isaiah chapter 24, verse 18. And Micah chapter 3, verse 10. From the top side of the upper part of this, reaching to the glass dome, to the bottom part of the lowest layer of the clouds, is called the open firmament of heaven, which is the first heaven. Genesis chapter 1, verse 20. What is under the whole heaven? Under the whole heaven are the following scriptures, which is not exhaustive but plenteous. Exodus chapter 17, verse 14. Deuteronomy chapter 2, verse 25. Deuteronomy chapter 4, verses 19. And also chapter 7, verse 24. Chapter 9, verse 14. Chapter 28, verse 23. Job chapter 41, verse 11. Ecclesiastes chapter 3, verse 1. And chapter 28, verse 24. Chapter 37, verse 2. Verse 3, rather. 2 Kings chapter 14, verse 27. Ecclesiastes chapter 1, verse 13. Ecclesiastes chapter 2, verse 3, and Genesis chapter 6, verses 17, as well as chapter 7, verse 19. And then, the birds of the air. Yes, the air below the clouds, more like where we see them. Ecclesiastes chapter 10, verse 20, Matthew chapter 6, verse 26, and Psalms chapter 8, verse 8. And spiritually speaking, in the spiritual realm that most people can't see, because most people are too stick-necked and too hard in the head to believe, because they don't want to believe. It's just point and simple. It's point blank right there. They just don't want to believe it. So I'd rather believe in a lie than the truth. But here's the truth of the thing. In the spiritual realm, Satan is the prince of the power of the air. In other words, he does not rule, he does not go to, he does not visit heaven. In other words, he's not able to go above the cloud. He's not even able to go at the cloud or at the bottom part of the cloud. Satan is the prince of the power of the air. Ephesians chapter 2, verse 2. Satan's goal, you can find that in 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 8, James chapter 4, verse 7, Job chapter 1, verse 7, and also Revelation chapter 12, verse 12. Satan is the god of this world. 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 4. And that's why we have people like myself who fight against devils. A veteran of spiritual warfare I am. And God does recognize veterans of spiritual warfare. So for any and every veteran of spiritual warfare who actually literally fight against devils, whether it be doctrines of devils, or they actually go out there and deal with demonically possessed and stuff like that, such as I do, thank you for your service to King and country. The spiritual world. The spiritual world is darkness. There's scripture for that, and I will also have to pin that in the pinned comment section below as well. The people who have not heard of God are in the darkness of this world. Isaiah chapter 9, verse 2, and Matthew chapter 4, verse 16. Crooked people are as darkness. Proverbs chapter 4, verse 19. True people of God are a light in the world. Luke chapter 1, verse 79. That represents Messiah. The Messiah is the ultimate light in the world. In Isaiah chapter 59, verse 9, and Matthew chapter 5, verse 14, we represent the light. John chapter 8, verse 12, and chapter 1, verse 9. The law of God is a light, a type of Messiah. Proverbs chapter 6, verse 23, Psalms chapter 119, verse 105. Those who disobey God and his gospel will walk in the ways of darkness. Proverbs chapter 2, verse 13, and John chapter 3, verse 19. The face of the earth. Yes, the face of the earth. The earth has a face. In other words, it's completely flat. Completely flat. The face of the earth, Exodus chapter 13, verse 16, Deuteronomy chapter 7, verse 6, Numbers chapter 12, verse 3, Genesis chapter 11, verses 4 through 9. In spirituality, Satan is the prince of this world. John chapter 14, verse 30. The kingdoms of this world are Satan's. Luke chapter 4, verse 6. The kingdoms of this world will be God's. Revelation chapter 11, verse 5, or verse 15 rather. Devils roam the earth. Luke chapter 11, verse 24. Human ghosts also roam the earth. Job chapter 14, verse 10. Principality spirits over countries, whether good, Daniel chapter 10, verse 21 and 12, verse 1, or bad. Isaiah chapter 19, verse 3, Ephesians chapter 6, verse 12, Psalms chapter 33, verse 12, and Isaiah chapter 37, verse 16. Where the one and only true and living God is not worshipped, devils are. 2 Kings chapter 1, verse 16, Deuteronomy chapter 32, verse 17, and 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 20, and Ephesians chapter 6, verse 12. The land of the living is where we are. Ezekiel chapter 32, verse 27. And then there are seas. Genesis chapter 1, verse 9 and 10. And then the earth itself has borders. Yes, borders of the earth, not the borders of nations. There is also a scripture for that too. This is not concerning the borders of nations. This is considering the border of the entire earth. So the earth, yes, a flat earth that has borders. The borders of the earth, the proof of which can be seen in Psalms chapter 74, verse 17, and also Job chapter 28, verse 24. The earth is terrestrial. 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 40. Under the face of the earth, spiritually, hell is under the earth. Hell is under the earth's surface. Isaiah chapter 14, verse 9, and also verse 15. Proverbs chapter 15, verse 24, and Luke chapter 16, verse 23. Devils usually come and go from hell. 1 Chronicles chapter 10, verse 13. Under the face of the earth, physically. People are buried. Jeremiah chapter 16, verse 4, chapter 25, verse 33, Ecclesiastes chapter 8, verse 10, and 1 Sam chapter 31, verse 13. In the fountains of the deep. Genesis chapter 7, verse 11, and also chapter 8, verse 2. You can dig holes in the ground. Deuteronomy chapter 23, verse 13, Matthew chapter 25, verse 18. From the top of the face of the surface to the bottom of the earth are the foundations of the earth. Isaiah chapter 51, verse 16, and Psalms chapter 104, verses 5 through 9. The bottom of the earth is set upon pillars and is stationary. 1 Sam chapter 2, verse 8. Job chapter 9, verse 6. Psalms chapter 104, verse 5. God bears or holds the pillars of the earth up and together. Psalms chapter 75, verse 3. Under the bottom of the earth, water, literally, is under the earth. The earth floats on water. Exodus chapter 20, verse 4. Chapter 24, verse 1. Second, and also chapter 24, verse 2. Genesis chapter 7, verse 11. Job chapter 38, verses 8 through 11. And Proverbs chapter 8, verses 24 through 30. Ladies and gentlemen, that was a very condensed version of the entire flat earth and the heavens and the seas in the way that God created it according to the scriptures, not in accordance to at all my opinion, my interpretation of scripture, or my belief. That is purely by and only by scripture alone. As it is said in Latin, sola scriptura, as it is translated in English, solely by the scripture I have just ministered to you and wrote them down, and I have specifically told you the scriptures to look up that you may look up for yourself in the King James Version, or, if you may, the complete Jewish Bible. Either one of those two, but if you're going to look it up in correct context, and if you want to choose the most correct Bible to do so out of, the King James Version will do just fine. Not the New King James Version, but the original King James Version or the 1611 King James Version. So look it up out of that and you'll get it out of a more accurate description of it. So again, this teaching by Scripture, from the Scripture, and only through the Scripture. So I have absolutely no opinion within this. I have absolutely no interpretation within this or any personal belief in it. And by personal belief, I'm saying I'm not giving you what my personal belief it is. I'm giving you what the Scripture says it is. So that's just the way it is. I teach you what the Scripture says, whether you like it or not. If you don't like it, that's your problem, that you don't like the Scriptures and that you don't like what the Scriptures say. So, yes, I do have belief in this stuff, but I'm not teaching you my belief. I'm teaching you what the Scripture says for itself. I'm feeding you the word straight from the horse's mouth or feeding you the word straight from the Scripture itself. So, it is up to you to believe the truth for what the Scripture says for itself or to deny it. And if you choose to deny it, you choose to deny God, and that's all there is to it. So, deny Scripture, deny God. Accept the Scripture, accept God. So, and also rightly divide the word of truth. So, because there are some things that's incorrect, but this isn't one of those things. And if I do intend on doing that, but that'll be later down the road. Such as the name Jesus is an incorrect name. So, I do not believe in a Jesus, a pagan deity. So, that is a false pagan idol worship, but that goes into a whole different thing. Just giving you an example. The right name is Yeshua, not Jesus. So, don't worship Jesus, worship Yeshua, y'all. So, but that's a different Bible study for a different time, and also a different Scripture study for a different time. But for now, I'm giving you this not of my own belief, not of my own opinion, or not even of any kind of personal interpretation. I do not teach out of my belief. I do not teach out of my personal interpretation or out of my own opinion. My opinions, I keep that to myself, and I keep it out of ministry. Personal interpretation, I don't do that. I keep that out of any kind of ministry. And my belief, I keep that out of ministry. So, I just plainly feed you the Scripture, and that's all there is to it. Like it or not, that's just the way it is. But anyways, thank you guys for listening. Thank you guys for watching. I appreciate it. I love every single one of you. If I didn't, I wouldn't do this. And I hope you guys enjoy the rest of your Sabbath. And as Shabbat Shalom, and also Lehitrot. Till next we meet.